In this week's lecture, we're going to be looking at the big kahuna of the Bible story. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the one who is claimed to be the Messiah in the Christian faith and in the story of the Bible. So we're going to be looking at the biographies that are written about Jesus. There's 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we're going to try to dive into exactly what is going on, what's the story of Jesus, what did Jesus think about himself, what are the interpretations and the significance of what he's doing. It's a big topic that's very important to understanding a Christian worldview. So it's important that we take our time and break this down. So this is going to be a little bit longer PowerPoint compared to the last few, but it's going to cover some very important things in understanding what the Bible is and the Christian worldview. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, as we turn to looking at the New Testament, before we do that, we need to go ahead and remind ourselves of what were the big problems from the Old Testament that were left unanswered. Because the story of the Old Testament has this building crescendo, a drama of looking for a solution to the problems of the world, and then it just ends without fixing anything or without providing this answer. And so we need to remind ourselves what the big problems from the Old Testament that the New Testament are going to try to answer. So first one is that we see that God has made this promise to Abraham, that Abraham is going to have all these descendants, and that these descendants are going to be of this family of God, and that they're going to be a blessing to the rest of the world. But we find that this people group, known as the Israelites at this time, are just as much a part of the problem as everyone else. In fact, rather being the good guys, they're kind of more like the villains and the bad guys, just contributing to this corruption that we see of humanity in this story. And so here's this God who wants to save the world through Israel, and now he's left with this challenge of, in order to do that, he's got to first save Israel, right? So that they can therefore then save the rest of the world, or that Israel can then be the solution, the salvation that we need. The other problem we see is that God's people, these Israelites, are incapable of listening and loving God, right? They're given all these commands and told that, hey, here's how you need to live to be people of justice and generosity, and it's all about them listening and loving God, and they're promised that if they follow this guideline that God has given them, this way of life, then they're going to be this blessing upon the world. But it's more than just the fact that they fail. It's the fact that they're incapable of succeeding. Their hearts are just too corrupt. So you remember the story with Pharaoh in Egypt, and his heart was hard, and he couldn't surrender to the well wishes and the desires and the sovereignty of Yahweh. Well, that's what's happening right here. We're seeing in the heart of the people that they are just as bad as Pharaoh, that they don't want to listen to what this God has to do. They don't want to love him. In fact, they're incapable of doing that. And so here's this problem where God wants to use humanity to be part of his solution, but the humanity that he's having to work with are incapable of being what he wants them to be. We also see that God's people have ended up in exile, and while yes, they physically have returned from exile, the turn of the New Testament, they're still in a very oppressed state because they're not their own people. They don't have their independence, but rather instead they have to answer to an oppressive empire that's over them. So the Old Testament ends with it being Persia. In the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, it becomes the Greeks. And right before the New Testament begins, the Roman Empire rises up, takes over the Greek Empire. And so now it's the Romans, who are the worst of them all, who are now in charge over this minor, insignificant people group that have become known as the Jews by this turn of the century, or by this point in history. And so these Jews are now, they have these promises that God wants to use them, but they're kind of changed up. They're kind of with these boundaries upon them. They're having to answer to foreign pagan oppressive empires, and they just can't be who they have always wanted to be, who they know God wants them to be. They can't be the blessing upon the rest of the world because they have these barriers. And so we're seeing that while they're having to submit to a force that is evil, we're looking at this promise that they still have from God, that God plans to deal with this. He plans to confront evil at its source and defeat it with a promised Messiah. And so that's the big promise of the Old Testament that we're going to see in the next slide. Now, while the Old Testament ends with a lot of big problems that remain unanswered, it gives a lot of big promises as well that are really important that we grasp before we turn to the New Testament and we start looking at the biographies of Jesus. So they're all related primarily to this central figure known as the Messiah that we're looking for. And this Messiah is described in a lot of different ways. He's like the ultimate hero that we're looking forward to in the Bible. And so it's someone who is going to fulfill the promises of Abraham, meaning that he's going to build together a family that's going to be an eternal family that's going to never end. And this family, while it's in the world, it's going to be a blessing upon the rest of the world, that this Messiah is going to bring together and unleash the potential of God's people upon the world, that they're going to be this force for good that's going to radicalize and change culture and change the way the world works, and that other nations of people are going to be blessed because of it. This Messiah figure is also someone who is pictured as someone who's going to be greater than Moses. Now, Moses was a huge deal in the Old Testament. He was a huge deal in the beginning of Israel's story as he challenged Pharaoh. He led the people out of slavery. He was their priest. He was their prophet. He was their king even, and how he led them. And so this depiction of the Messiah is echoing a little bit of Moses, but presenting him as someone who's even greater than Moses. That he's going to lead this newfound family of God into a new home after he defeats evil. And he's going to be their priest, he's going to be their prophet, and he's going to be their king. What's more that we learned about this Messiah from the Old Testament is that this is going to be someone who's going to be born of the line of Judah and David. So he's not just going to be this mythical individual, but we're told that he's going to be of the family line of Judah, and then eventually it zooms in even more of the family line of David. So that's why the story after David starts tracking his descendants, because every single one of them has this promise, this question looming over them of, are you going to be this Messiah? And what we saw of the Old Testament is all of them fail. But in that promise that's made to David, we're seeing that this Messiah who's eventually going to come, he's going to have a love and loyalty to God that's greater than what David had. Remember, David had this great love and loyalty to God. We see that in the book of Psalms. We see that in his early life. But David failed to show ultimate loyalty to God, because when it came time after he got all that he wanted, he turned to a very dark path of adultery, of murder, or cover up. I'm like, this was the guy who, from the point up to David, looked like he was going to be this Messiah figure, and he turns out to fail. But God still gave this promise that one day, from the line of David, someone's going to rise up. And at first you think it's going to be his son Solomon, because Solomon is super wise and he brings about this decades era of peace in the land. And so it looks like maybe Solomon's going to be the Messiah that we're looking forward to. But Solomon also failed to obey God. But there's still this echoing promise that while these guys failed, one day there is going to be this Messiah of the line of David who's going to have his lineage tracking all the way back to David, who will be the one who will have a love and loyalty to God that will not falter, that he's going to be greater than David. He's going to be wiser than Solomon, so that the things he says and does are going to forever shape the thinking of the age. And so we're looking forward to this individual now who's going to be like that. We're also going to see that the intention of the promises of the Old Testament about the Messiah is that this Messiah is going to be someone who's going to end the cycle of exile. So remember, the first cycle of exile was that humanity was kicked out of the garden. They were exiled from God's presence. And then there was the exile of the Tower of Babel story, where humanity tried to gather together to dethrone God, and God had to exile them by confusing their languages and scattering them all over the place, right? And then there's the exile when God creates this new people group known as the Israelites, of the lineage of Abraham, and eventually they fall into their own exile into Babylon because they would not listen to God, they would not love God and obey him. And so we see this ongoing cycle of exile where humanity, rather than listening to God, chooses to rebel against God. They choose to sin, and then it leads into their own disaster, and God has to come in and rescue them. And so this Messiah is going to be someone who's going to break the cycle, who's going to provide an exit from this ongoing cycle of pain and chaos that humanity seems to be causing. So there's a lot of big promises here about this Messiah figure of what the Old Testament keeps pointing to as going to be the solution to all of the big problems that we're certainly left with in the Old Testament, but all the big problems that we see of humanity in accordance to the record and the narrative of the Old Testament. All right, so now that we have recapped all about the Old Testament that we ended with last lecture, we're going to now turn to discussing what the New Testament is. So on the next slide, we're going to watch a quick video that's going to give a brief overview of the entirety of the New Testament. And then after that, we're going to go zoom in a little bit more. We're going to answer the questions of what exactly is the New Testament, how it came to be, and then we're going to look at the Gospels and ask questions of, okay, what are the Gospels? Why are there 4 of them? Who wrote them? And what are they trying to communicate? And then after that, and the rest of the lecture, we're actually going to dive into the actual Gospels and look at what this life, death, and resurrection of this individual known as Jesus of the town of Nazareth, who claims to be the Messiah, and see what his story is, and see whether or not the New Testament actually is doing a well job in presenting him as the Messiah figure that the Old Testament was looking forward to. All right, so let's look and cover what exactly the New Testament is before we dive into the Gospels and look at them a little bit more specifically. So looking at the New Testament as a whole, it's a collection of 27 books, and the word book should be kind of in quotes because this is a mixture of different writing genres. There's like biographies, such as the Gospels. There are histories, such as the book of Acts. There are letters, like all that Paul writes. In fact, the majority of the New Testament are letters written to churches or individuals. And there's also apocalyptic writing, such as the book of Revelation. And so this is a collection of 27 books. They cover about 40 years of history. And so the primary amount of writing of the New Testament was arranged within about 30 years after Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection. And about 30 years later, all of the New Testament was written and being circulated during this time frame. We know that through a variety of different means and resources. Big one being that if Jesus died in AD 30, 33, sometime early 30s, and we know that Rome came in and destroyed Jerusalem and ancient Judaism in the 70s, AD 70s, then all these writings of Paul and the apostles and all these other individuals, none of them refer to that event. And there's a couple other speculations, but they all kind of get squished into this time frame. So they're all written relatively soon after the life of Jesus. And they're all kind of circulating around this idea of who he is and how the Christian community that follows the teachings of Jesus, how they need to live in this world now. And so some of the writers include Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's also Paul, who writes the majority of the New Testament. There's James, the half-brother of Jesus. There's Peter as well. And then there's a few unknowns. There's a few books that are speculated. They're usually credited to Paul, but some of them are scholars still like to throw debates all the time of who wrote what book and that sort of deal. Now the letters or the whole book of the New Testament is arranged very specifically. So it starts off with the 4 biographies or the Gospels of Jesus, and then it goes into the Acts account talking about the rise of the church. And then after that, it hits all the letters of Paul. And those letters are not written in chronological order of when he wrote them. They're all written in lengthwise. So then you go to Romans and then 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And they're all arranged from the longest books to his shortest books. And so that's very important. So we don't read them thinking that we're moving chronologically after we get past the book of Acts. After that, it's all kind of all over the place and trying to track the story and where things are at. But the whole Old Testament is carrying forward the themes of the Old Testament. And so everything we looked at, the problems of the Old Testament that it leaves us with, and these big promises, the New Testament is carrying the story forward, showing us how these promises came to light and how these big problems that we were left with get fulfilled in this coming Messiah. All a part of God's big story of seeking the restoration and the redemption of creation and humanity back into relationship with him. So we come now to the Gospels, which is translated as the good news. It's a proclamation of how God became king, because that's what gospel is. It's a word used during that time frame to announce that a king has arisen and is now governing over us. And so that's why all the biographies of Jesus are called the good news or the gospel of Jesus Christ, because they're all tracking how God became king, which we should recall from our previous lecture is a really big deal, because it started out where God rescued his people from slavery in Egypt. He was their king. He was praised as their king. And by the end of the Old Testament, people had given up on God being their king. And so this is kind of God's rescue and redemption of that fact of how did God come about being king of humanity and of a special people group all over again, and how is he continuing this story forward? Okay, so what exactly are the Gospels? Well, the Gospels are 4 biographies detailing the life, ministry, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. There's 4 of them. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in the next few slides, we're going to look at each one of those specifically and talk about the unique audience that they're trying to talk to, the unique perspective that they have, and their intention behind writing the biography of Jesus. Each one of them is unique. For instance, Matthew and John were apostles or disciples who followed Jesus, so they're kind of writing their eye accounts. The Gospel of Mark was probably the first gospel written, and then the Gospel of Luke was written by a Gentile who's not a Jew, and he's writing to a Gentile. The point being is that they're all written for a unique audience perspective. And we're going to break that down in the next few slides, because that's always an important thing whenever you're reading each gospel, to understand, okay, what is the author here trying to hint at and communicate? Because that's why sometimes there's slight variations on use of language or even similarity sometimes, different things like that, as they're trying to tell from their perspective the story of Jesus. Now, these are written roughly within 30 years after the events of Jesus. There's a couple different ways we know that. I mentioned that in the previous slide, but this is something that these documents were written in ancient Koine Greek, which means they were written in the written language of the day, so that they could be read. They were widely circulated. They're spread around a whole lot because they're trying to get this communication or this message across. Of this story of the good news of Jesus and providing their unique perspective on the accounts of Jesus. And so let's break it down, and let's start with the book of Matthew and see what we can learn about the book of Matthew, or the Gospel of Matthew, I mean. So the Gospel of Matthew was written by a guy who was a former tax collector who became one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. He's a Jew, and his primary audience that he's trying to target are other Jews. Now, that doesn't mean that you're only able to read this if you were of a Jewish lineage. That's not at all the point being here. But it's the fact that he's trying to specifically target Jews by getting them to see how the hope that they've been looking for and the Messiah has been fulfilled in Jesus. So his big focus is to show us how Jesus is the true Israel. So what Israel was supposed to be, and he reiterates some of the stories of Israel playing out in the life of Jesus. So some of them you can probably think of if you're familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, or so his Sermon on the Mount, that's an echo of how Moses went up on the mountain to receive God's laws and how the people were supposed to live. And now we've got Jesus up on a mountain, and he's telling people, here's how God wants you to live. And then there's the wilderness story of Israel that's played out in Jesus facing his 40 days of temptation in the wilderness. So there's all these echoes that Matthew keeps pointing out to show us how Jesus is the true Israel, that he's the one who's, remember that Israel needs to be rescued. Well, that's happening in Jesus, who is what Israel was supposed to be, so that through him the world can be rescued, right, as he's the true Messiah. So that's Matthew's big focus and why he's primarily targeting a Jewish audience. Now, we can still get appreciation from that if we don't come from a Jewish background, but that's his main focus of showing us how Jesus is fulfilling the promises of the Old Testament and showing this genealogy of how Jesus fit in with the being of the lineage of Judah and David and all that. So the gospel that follows the gospel of Matthew is the gospel of Mark, and Mark begins dramatically different than Matthew does, and Luke and John do as well, where Mark just dives straight into the action. He doesn't deal with any backstory or the early years of Jesus. He just dives right into the action, and that's kind of an important thing to know about Mark. His focus is to be super clear, super concise, and all pointing back to Isaiah chapter 52 and 53, where he's trying to, the best he can, as quickly as he can, describe how Jesus fits in with this suffering servant. Now, Mark was this guy who was a later convert and missionary of the church. He was not one of the disciples, but it's believed that he partnered with the disciple Peter to write this gospel account. And it's also believed that this might be the earliest gospel account of Jesus. So early, in fact, that Luke and Matthew probably used Mark as a reference or a resource in their own creations of their own gospel accounts or their biographies, where they allude back a lot of times to Mark and his tale of things. So this is a very fun read of the Gospels because it just has Jesus going from one scene to the next. He's fighting demons, and then he's healing people, and then he's upsetting all sorts. But he's like just boom, 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 all action. It's a very fun read of the Gospel story of Jesus. Next, we have the Gospel of Luke, and Luke, we are able to tell, is someone who was highly educated. He was a Gentile, which means he wasn't a Jew. He wasn't of the family lineage of Israel. And we can tell he's highly educated based on the use of his language, his grammatical use. This is a guy that Christian history suggests that he probably was a doctor or something. So this is a guy who very well educated. He does all this research. He was not one of the disciples or apostles. He was a missionary according to the book of Acts, traveling with Paul. But this is a guy who you can tell he has painstakingly gone from one witness to another to compile this narrative of this biography of Jesus and of his later book, the book of Acts, which counts as more of like his part 2 of his story of Jesus that he's telling. And he has an intent to give this not only a historical account of events, to be a journalist in this, but he's targeting primarily Gentiles. And it's primarily focusing on the social justice reform that Jesus kind of brings. So a lot of Luke's perspectives and stories kind of deal with Jesus kind of dealing with the poor, widows, those who have experienced extreme brokenness. He talks a lot about this reversal of power we see, such as the famous story of Zacchaeus, that wee little man. Luke records it to kind of show us that here was this one guy who had all this power, and now it's a complete upside down way of life, this huge social justice reform that affects the whole community because this guy had encountered Jesus. You see this also in some of the parables that Luke records, such as the famous story of the prodigal son. Where here's Luke, he's got this social justice reform motive in some of the aspects and stories that he brings about of Jesus, of telling, here's what Jesus did, and here's how it made a positive difference upon the lowly, the broken, those who society had forgotten. And here's Jesus who talking about how Jesus came in and changed the power structures and the way of understanding and thinking of the world around him and how he acted with people. Finally, we have the Gospel of John. And John was probably the last gospel to be written, and it's unique compared to the other 3. So John was the youngest disciple of Jesus. He was probably just a teenager, 13 or 14 years old, when he was following Jesus. But he wrote many of the letters and books of the New Testament. So there's 3 letters of John later on in the Bible, in the New Testament. He also wrote the book of Revelation. And so this is a guy, he has a lot of contribution to our understanding of Jesus. And the teachings that have been shared about, of John's teachings have been shared and passed down through church history for a long period of time. Now, in the Gospel of John, he's primarily writing to a Gentile audience. So this is not a Jewish audience. This is an audience of everyone who's not Jew, pretty much. And in this, it's rather unique because he has the fewest miracles and parables of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have a lot of parables and miracles of Jesus, but the Gospel of John does not have this. But what the Gospel of John does have is a lot more speeches of Jesus, and that's intentional because John is trying to show us the heart of Jesus. Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are trying to show us the actions of Jesus and how they fulfilled his role as the Messiah and redeeming Israel and therefore redeeming the rest of the world. And they're primarily focused upon those elements. The Gospel of John, I think John already knew that those other Gospels were being passed around, so he wanted us to see the heart of Jesus, what this character was like, and how he loved and how he treated people. And that's more of John's intention, is to show us what was Jesus passionate about, what was his character like, what was his heart, and so that his readers, and his intention is that his readers would fall in love with this Jesus. Now, as all four of these biographies are telling of the exact same story, though told from different perspectives and different intentions, it's important to see that therefore they all have the exact same setting. So what is the world of the Gospels? Well, we have to see that there is an oppressive Roman Empire that is ruling the age at the time. And the Romans did not get along with the Jews. It's a very violent time. It's a very scary time to be a Jew during this era. And so Rome, even though they're far away, they've put in place different puppet kings. And so there's the King Herods and Agrippa and all these other kings that Rome kind of puts in place. They're more like governors, even though there's also Roman governors. Rome has a very complicated system on how their empire ran. It was through a lot of delegations. So even though we get accounts of King Herod and things like that, we have to see several things. First off, in the accounts of the Gospels, when we see King Herod, both Herod the Great and his later descendant of King Herod during the trial of Jesus, who are different Herods, we have to see that these guys are kind of puppet kings put in place. They're put in place so that Rome could appease the people. They could have some feeling like they've got someone who's their delegate, someone who represents them back to Rome, but who still answers the Rome, even though there's a Roman governor at the time, such as Pontius Pilate in the narratives of or in the trials of Jesus. At the same time, we have to see that King Herod is not of the lineage of David. He's not a true Judahite king. He's a guy who's appointed by Rome, and he's just a cruel guy. So the Jews are living in this state where the guy who's supposed to be the representative is constantly cruel to them, constantly stealing from them. And then you got the Romans, who just make a mockery of your faith. The Romans were known for coming into the temple and just trashing things, destroying things. They would basically, these are people who they walk into your home and they would demand, like, hey, you have to leave your home because they're going to stay there for a while. Like, the soldiers are incredibly cruel to the Jews during the time. This is not a good time to be a Jew. And because of this, there's a lot of rebellions that kind of spring up, where the Jews all rally together in this spirit of anger and mob mentality, and they try to fight back against Rome, and they always fail. Like, you're talking about some country Jews trying to fight against the military machine of Rome, and they just fail miserably every single time. Like, Rome is an unstoppable force, which is part of the reason why the promises and the ideology of the Messiah becomes so popular during this time frame, because as one rebellion failed and another one rose up and then it failed again over and over, these promises that one day God is going to send a Messiah who's going to defeat the oppressive empire and establish a new humanity by rescuing Israel, and then Israel's going to be on top. This promise starts to grow bigger and bigger, and they start to interpret that the big enemy has to be Rome, because Rome was this evil force that just could not be beat. And so they start to interpret Rome as the big enemy that the Messiah needs to beat. What's also important to know is that there's this general feeling of exile. Like, even though they're back in the land, they're still in bondage, still waiting for a deliverance. And in this space, there's a lot of false messiahs who rise up before and after the story of Jesus. And all of them try to start these rebellions through violent means. So all those constant Jewish rebellions I mentioned were usually led by some individual standing up and saying, now is the time for God to become king, and he's doing it through me, and people would rally behind this individual, and they would get slaughtered by the Romans. It's a very gruesome, bloody time frame that we get the story of Jesus of Nazareth rising up and him saying that he's the Messiah, but he's doing things very differently than what's expected. He's acting in a lot of uncommon ways, and he seems to be more interested in addressing the corruption in the heart and the Jewish people rather than in Rome, which was a huge eye-opener because everyone thought the Messiah was going to do that towards Rome. But here's this different Messiah, Jesus, who's actually more interested in redeeming and rescuing his own people so that through that effort, he would then rescue and redeem all of humanity. It's a complicated story in some ways. It takes sometimes multiple readings to kind of pick up as we're separated by 2,000 years. But we have to understand that this is not a pleasant time to live. This is not a time where you'd want to be a Jew living in the Middle East during this time frame. You were the scum of the earth because the Rome was in charge, and Rome was this unstoppable evil force, and your entire way of life was shaped by the will of the Roman emperor. And then you got this hope. One day a Messiah is going to come who's going to fix this, who's going to conquer evil, he's going to rescue the day. And that's the setting that the Gospels introduce of announcing, hey, one has come, this Messiah has come, his name's Jesus, and this is how he has confronted evil. And so we need to get more into the Gospel narratives to see that how that happens, but that's kind of the setting that all the Gospels are dealing with. So a quick word needs to be made of how do we exactly read the Gospels. And no, I don't mean just reading left to right in a typical way of reading. These documents, these biographies are rather unique. They're written in a style, an ancient style that's different than our own style. So yes, in one sense, we can sit down and read them like a constant narrative. We have to see that the ancient writers are trying to communicate something about Jesus in this biography. And there's really 5 big pillars. I just want to very quickly mention. Some of them we've already kind of hint a little bit already. But these are kind of 5 pillars that all these gospel accounts are trying to communicate. The first one is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Israel story. That everything we saw in the Old Testament was all leading up to Jesus, and that's what all the Gospels are trying to tell us. Some of them that do that right off the bat, such as the Gospel of Matthew of hitting on the genealogy of Jesus, all right? So all these stories are all talking about this is not an addition or this is not, oh, God messed up in the Old Testament, so now here's plan B of Jesus. No, everything was pointed towards Jesus. So he's the fulfillment of the Israel story, and I'm hoping we've got that kind of clear as I looked at last week's lecture and we saw how this story, God has been moving these people forward, and that there are these big promises that keep being made, and we're left with these cliffhangers, and now we're seeing how Jesus is the fulfillment to those cliffhangers. He's the fulfillment to the Israel story. This is also something that's being communicated, is that Jesus was God incarnate, that in the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth happened to be God incarnate, that God took on flesh and he lived as Jesus and he became this Jewish Messiah and also was known as the Son of God. That this is God in the flesh, his identity walking among us, and that he's also the Messiah. So this is the next pillar. This is the special role that Jesus has played out that brings about the rescue of the world. And remember, just recap, some of the expectations of the Messiah was that he was going to defeat evil and subdue the nations, and that has this idea in place of, well, this is going to be Rome, and we're going to look at what exactly is that in reality. There's also the expectation that he's going to establish God's eternal kingdom, that he's going to build this family, and then there's also the expectation that he's going to restore and redeem Israel. And what that looks like in practice is that he's going to restore the temple, and he's going to bring God back to his people and bring them back to a state of a true worship of God where they're going to listen and love God. And so that's another pillar of the story, that Jesus is the Messiah. Another pillar is that it's Jesus versus the world powers, and so we've got Jesus interacting with the Pharisees, with the religious system. We've got him seeing interacting with the economic system, the political system. These narratives are constantly showing Jesus battling different cultural, social, economic, political organizations and powers and understanding of the day, and how Jesus is defeating each one of them one by one. And another important pillar of the gospel narratives is Jesus launching his new community. That what Jesus started and invested in with 12 guys, it leads into what the modern day standing of billions of followers of Jesus. And so the gospel narratives are the story of how is God going to, through Jesus, launch this new community that's kind of hitting on all these other pillars that are all founded upon what Jesus is and what he has done and how that affects the rest of the world. So the gospels are kind of hitting on these things. So when we read the gospel narratives, we need to have these pillars kind of kept in the back of our mind. So all four gospels all have a central main theme behind them. While they approach this theme from their own perspective and targeting their own unique audience, all of them have this central main theme that's really important that we grasp as well. Even when we understand how we read the gospel with the previous pillars, all of them are united in this central main theme that's very important that we get across. And it has to do with remembering what the grand narrative is. And so we remember this grand narrative is that God wants to have this perfect relationship with humanity, where they listen to him, where they love him, and through that blessing is brought into the world. And humanity has messed it up. And so God has made this promise in the Old Testament that he's going to fix this. He's going to restore creation. He's not going to just wipe it clean and start all over, right? We've already seen how that doesn't work. We're seeing a God who wants to take a long, patient route of restoring the heart of creation and bringing humanity back to him. And so what the Gospels are saying is that this long-awaited future age of a newly restored creation that's been hoped for, that's been prayed about, that's been sought after, is invading in the present evil age, right? Which is the terminology used to describe the present age where humanity is not listening to God, right? And so it's saying that in this big hope that they've been waiting for has invaded in the present evil age, that all with the purpose to restore humanity to its intended purpose, and all of it centers upon the faithfulness of Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah, as the Son of God, being God incarnate, bringing about the rescue. And so that's what the main theme of the Gospels is that the long-awaited hope of a restored creation is beginning to invade humanity, invade this world through God becoming incarnate and living as Jesus and being faithful to his promises to bring about the long-awaited rescue of all of humanity. And we're going to see that a little bit clearer in the next slide when we watch the little video that's provided that explains this in a lot clearer way, and a lot clearer than what I'm able to do. Now, as we actually dive into the Gospels, we're going to jump from one Gospel to the next, as we're going to try to piece together this chronological story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and to see how he has fulfilled the Israel story, as he's brought it to its climax and brought about this restoration that's promised by God in the Old Testament, how this comes to bear into even to modern day standings in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, each gospel kind of begins a little bit differently than the other one. Now, each one of them has their own unique focus on this. So, for instance, we're going to begin by looking at John. And John kind of starts by talking about in the very beginning when he opens up his book in John chapter 1, verse 1. And that's an echo back to Genesis. And so he's announcing to us in John chapter 1, which I'm going to go ahead and read for us, which reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things are made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And so right from the beginning, John wants us to see that Jesus is God in the flesh, that he was with God, he was God, and he was used as the means of the creation of all things so that everything could be good and be made for the furthering of the blessing of God's goodness into this world. and even identifies to us a little bit of this purpose and this tension here, as this God, this Jesus, is identified as the source of all of life and all that is good, and it opposes all that which is not of God, which John summarizes as the darkness. That isn't to say that in the terms of the Bible that good and evil are on equal terms. It just says that this is identifying that there is something in this world that seems to be in rebellion to this God. And John is associating that back with Jesus, saying that this is happening in Jesus. And then he records something remarkable that happens. It's in verse 14. It says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." So oftentimes when we read the Gospels, we think it's a big echo of just trying to say over and over, look, Jesus is God in the flesh. And that's certainly true, but what it's primarily doing, all the Gospels kind of do this, is they kind of announce right from the beginning, hey, we want to tell you about how God became human, and we want to tell you all of what this God did once he came and interacted with our world. And so here, John is telling us that this Word became flesh, this Jesus came into being as God in the flesh, and he says that he dwelt among us, which is translated as tabernacle. Now, if you recall in our previous lecture when we talked about the tabernacle and how significant it was, you should pick up that this is a significant thing that John is stating, that what happened in the tabernacle and later on in the temple is now happening in a human being, this Jesus, who's identified as the source and giver of all of life. He's identified as being omnipresent, being who God was. He's part of creation. This is John is announcing right from the beginning something rather dramatic, that this is God in the flesh who has come to make his home among us, and that changes things. We'll see in the next slide when we look at Matthew. Matthew has a little bit of a focus on, okay, this God has come, and looking at the Messiah aspect of his intentions of coming in the world. So in the previous slide, we looked at how John goes all the way back to the beginning of time, saying that here's Jesus being a part of it. Matthew, his example of how the story opens up, is he goes and he starts at the birth of Jesus, but he ties it in with all of Israel's history. So his opens up with this long genealogy. Now, we a lot of times like to skip over that because all of it is saying so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, and then so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, and onward and onward and onward. And in our day and age, we don't usually track beyond our grandparents or great-grandparents. And so this idea of being part of a culture that was richly dependent upon your genealogy and your family line is something that's a little uncommon in a Western society of today. But it's important that we understand that because Matthew is tying in this grand narrative. So he starts off by saying, this is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then jumping down to verse 17, after he gives his long list of all these descendants going all the way from Abraham all the way up to Jesus, he says, so all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. And that's kind of Matthew's way of trying to show us that God's faithfulness to Abraham and the promises made to Abraham have come to light, and they're being told in this individual known as Jesus, just as well as the promises made to David are being played out and finding their culmination in Jesus, and that Jesus is the continuation of Israel's long story. And so this is Matthew's way of kind of, remember we talked about that Matthew has a heart to kind of reach to the Jewish population. This is kind of how he's doing it. He's showing us that God in the flesh has taken on the role of what Israel was meant to be. And this is a really dramatic statement. And it's Matthew's way of basically announcing, Matthew and John, when we see them together, that God has come in the flesh. He has come to make his dwelling among us, and he has come to bring about a culmination and a fulfillment of everything he's promised from the Old Testament going forward. Now, when we look at how the Gospel of Mark opens up, it's a little bit different. Mark skips over the whole birth narrative, the Nazareth story, Mary, the virgin birth. He kind of skips over that and he gets right into the action and kind of opens up by telling us that there was this guy named John, not the could be confused with John who wrote the Gospel of John, but this is a different John. guy who's commonly known as John the Baptist. And he's going around, he's announcing to everybody that he believed it was time for God to become king again, that God was about to do something great, he was about to send the Messiah, and that if people wanted to be on board, they had to get their lives together and get baptized as a sign that they were joining in with what they believed that God was about to do in their day and age. And so here comes along Jesus, he gets baptized, and we're told in Mark chapter 1, verse 9, it says, "In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, 'You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased.'" That phrase is something rather unique. It's something actually said about Israel that God declares over Israel when he rescued them from Egypt. And it's something he says to them over and over again. And so here's God. He's given this pronouncement on this individual named Jesus. We see a display of the Trinity in action here is God the Father speaking, God the Holy Spirit is ascending upon Jesus, and then Jesus, of course, being recognized as the Son of God. And so we get this dynamic of God and these three capacities being witnessed all in the same moment as Jesus is declared to be God's Son. And this is kind of the springboard for Mark. So everything that follows is kind of like a quick rush after this. So next thing you know, we see Jesus, he's facing off with forces of evil and his temptation narrative and healing people who are possessed and who are facing terrible sickness. And we see him forgiving sins, which, if you recall, is something that was kind of promised of this was how God was going to end the exile of humanity, by forgiving what they've done and bringing them back into fellowship with him. And so we see this Jesus, he's automatically right off the start doing some really dramatic, radical things after he's pronounced this title over him by God that, hey, you're my Messiah, you're my Son, I'm sending you out, you're the one I'm well pleased with. And so this is a very intense start. It summarizes a lot of actually what Jesus does in his narrative. Is he's going out, he's facing off with forces of evil, and he's forgiving sins and changing lives. There's a famous story in both Matthew and Luke, and Mark kind of hits on it in basically a single sentence. But there's this moment right after Jesus has this pronouncement that he's the Messiah, and it's given to him not by men, but it's given to him by God. We see Jesus, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days. And it's actually kind of funny if you think about it, because here he is, he's given this mission of, hey, you have this responsibility to save humanity. And he knows that he's got about 3 years to do it. And so what's the first thing he does? Well, he spends the first 40 days going by himself out in the wilderness to think about that. It's kind of funny. You think he'd be in a rush or need to jump to the next task. I know for me, I'm a little bit of a type A, so if I was given this task, in my mind, I'm already thinking, okay, here's what I got to do every single day. Here's what I got to break down and accomplish. But here's the Jesus guy, and it's kind of ironic where his first thought is, let me go spend 40 days by myself. But the narrative of Luke and Matthew is trying to show us something very specific about this. So it's alluding back to how Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness. But if you recall, when they were in the wilderness for 40 years, they were constantly failing God. They could not trust God. They could not listen to him. When the pressure built up, rather than lean upon God, they would rather instead flee from God. They would go about doing things their own way, choosing their own autonomy, and they'd get themselves into a lot of trouble. And so here's Jesus. He's in a similar situation. And Luke and Matthew are recording this narrative for us to show us that while Israel failed, Jesus succeeds. He doesn't disobey God. He chooses to trust God, to put his faith in God, to listen and to love God. Remember, that's rather dramatic, because this Messiah figure was going to have to be someone who was going to redeem and rescue Israel. And what we're seeing is, here's Jesus. He's being pronounced as the true Israel. And it's being seen as he's facing the exact same things that Israel faced when they're in the wilderness and how they failed, but Jesus is succeeding. It's also an allusion all the way back to, say, Adam. who failed to listen and love God, who failed to trust God, and sent humanity in a downward spiral. And here's Jesus. He's faced with the same pressures. He has this encounter with this Satan who's trying to lead him away, just like what happened with Adam. But Jesus is choosing instead to trust God. It's also an allusion to Abraham, for instance, where Abraham has his own moment where God tells him, hey, I want to build a great nation through you, and they're going to be a blessing to all the world. And the first thing that Abraham does is he doubts this. He tells people that his wife is not his wife and things like that. And Abraham, he failed. But here's Jesus who, when push comes to shove, he sticks to his guns. He trusts and listens to his God. And that's a showing that Luke and Matthew in his account of this is trying to show us that this Jesus is succeeding where Israel failed. He's the better replacement. He's what Israel and Adam and Abraham, all of them were supposed to be. Then Jesus, when he leaves the wilderness experience after he passes the test, he goes around telling people what we see in Matthew chapter 4, verse 17, that from that time Jesus began to preach, saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He's declaring now has the time come for humanity to be in a returned relationship, a redeeming relationship with their God and the Creator. It's time for God to be back on his throne, for God to be calling the shots on what is right and wrong, and for the people to be listening and loving God. And that declaration that the time has come for God's kingdom to be present and in reality before the people means that the declaration of a king has come. So here's Jesus, and he's going around declaring, guys, the time has come for humanity to come back, to listen and love God, for God's promises to be invading in this world, and that's happening by the coming of the king, and he's presenting himself as the king, right? And that's important because if the kingdom is coming, then so are the promises of God. This promise of God is, remember that God's family is going to be a blessing upon the world, and that through them God was going to fix this world. And so this is what Jesus is saying. He's like, it's time for God to bring that promise to bear, where he's going to create a new family, and this family is going to be a blessing upon the world as they choose to listen and love their king, God, right? And who Jesus is presenting himself as this king. All right. It's also kind of an echo to what Moses did before Pharaoh. When Pharaoh would not let the people go, and Moses came in front of him and says, hey, I have a message from God. He says, let my people go. It's time for my people to be freed from slavery. This is kind of Jesus's Moses moment, you can say, where he's announcing that evil is on the verge of being defeated like Pharaoh in Egypt. Now, if you recall, we looked at one of the elements of a Messiah was that they were going to be someone who was greater than Moses, who's going to have a love for God, greater than David, and who's going to have a wisdom of how to live greater than Solomon's. And so right after Jesus goes around announcing that he's the king of the universe and it's time for God's promises to come to bear as people would come and follow him, he gathers together this following, and he goes up on a mountain with this crowd that's following him, and he sits down and he starts to teach them how to live. So that's recorded to us in Matthew chapter 5. And if you think about it, there's a lot of echoes here going all the way back once again to Moses. Remember, Moses went up on a mountain to receive God's law on how the people of Israel, who after they've been rescued and redeemed, how they would live as God's rescued people, how they would be people of justice and generosity. Well, here we have Jesus. He goes around announcing, hey, God has come to free us. God's reign is now coming into the world in and through the work of Jesus. Now Jesus goes up on a mountain with this crowd who are interested in what he has to say and these promises. And he sits down, he tells them, here's how you live now as the rescued people of God, right? And so it's in chapters 5, 6, and 7 as he kind of gives this Sermon on the Mount teaching, this is how God desires for the Jesus movement and the people who follow Jesus and the people who trust him as the Messiah. Here's how he's wanting them to live as salt and light in the world, as the meek and humble rather than those who seek power for themselves. It's this echo as well that Jesus is fulfilling a prophecy that was given by the prophets in the Old Testament. This is a big moment where Jesus is kind of presenting himself wiser than Solomon, with a greater love for God than David, and a heart to lead God's people into the land and the place where they should be, this status of being a blessing upon the world, and into the home that they are promised, like Moses. So after Jesus gets done speaking this Sermon on the Mount, looking like Moses, he does something that is actually a huge statement for his day, but for something that in our day and age we just kind of gloss over. But he chooses 12 guys to follow him, to be his disciples. Now, we would a lot of times we just kind of gloss over that and we're like, okay, yeah, he just picked 12 guys and he's like, hey, I'm going to invest in you, 12 guys, I'm going to work with you, we're going to do great things. But Jesus is actually saying something rather dramatic that the people of his day would pick up on. And if we've been following carefully through the narrative of the Bible, we should pick up on as well. So if you recall, when you look in the Old Testament, there's Abraham, and Abraham has Isaac, and Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons. And these 12 sons become the heads of 12 tribes of Israel. And so in the Old Testament, people would identify themselves on what tribe they're part of. For instance, you've got David, who was of the tribe of Judah. You had Saul, who was of the tribe of Benjamin. There's the priests, who are the tribe of Levi. And so 12 was a very significant number for the Jews, for the Israelites, because it symbolized, this is us. This is our magic number. This is our state of being. This is our identity. And so here's Jesus. By him selecting 12 guys, he's making a statement that he's creating a new Israel, that he's restoring Israel. Remember, that's one of the big themes of the Messiah, that they were going to redeem Israel and through that then save the rest of the world. So he picks 12 guys. What's also unique about this is that he's leading 12 guys around the country, telling them about what it means to be God's people. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like what God did back when he led the 12 tribes out of Egypt and through the wilderness, and he taught them, here's how you follow God's will for your life. Here's how you follow God's laws. And so Jesus in this moment, he's doing something really subtle, but something that has a very powerful message, where he's saying, hey, I'm restoring Israel, and he's not counted among the 12. He's the outlier, the leader who is leading the 12. And so he's kind of putting himself in the position of God. He's like, hey, I'm restoring Israel. This is my new Israel. And I'm now leading them and teaching them what it means to love God and love people. And so he's putting himself in this position where he's claiming a divine status, that every town he went to, people would pick up on this immediately. So Jesus starts traveling around with these 12 guys, and he's going from place to place. He's teaching, he's healing the sick, he's talking about how God has come back to become king, and it's happening through him, and he's inviting people to surrender their lives to this. And it seems all wonderful, but for the most part, Jesus' focus has been primarily with his own Jewish people. But then a point in time comes where he starts to broaden out, and we find that he ends up even in a place called Samaria, which is a bordering nation of Israel during the first century, and it's rather a hotbed of a political drama, because these are people who are considered half-Jews. Some would even throw out the word of abominations. They did not get along with the Jewish people. There was oftentimes recordings of wars that would happen between them. So the Samaritans were kind of viewed as their enemies. And in this, we find that in this setting that no Jew would ever go to, we find that Jesus goes out of his way and he starts to reach out to them. He starts to go into their places. In fact, we have it recorded to us in John chapter 4, this little story where Jesus goes and he encounters a Samaritan village and he starts preaching to them, he heals them, things like that. And we're told in verse 39 that many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. And they said to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world. Now that's kind of a crucial moment, because this is showing that Jesus, he's reaching out to surrounding nations. And if you recall, that's what the promise of Abraham was to be, right? That God was going to make a new family through Abraham that's going to be a blessing to all the world, to all the other nations. And then you get this message of the Messiah, that he's going to rule over all the nations, and then that people are going to come from all over the place to come follow him. And so we're seeing that happening in this narrative, where Jesus is going to a group of people who are not of his ethnicity, and he's reaching out to them, and they're coming to find that there's a new beginning, that there's a opportunity for them to be included into this family of God that Jesus seems to be starting. So it shows us that this Jesus, he's very inclusive. He wants all types of people to come and follow him. And remember, this was a big promise of the Old Testament, that when the Messiah comes, all the nations were going to start coming to be a part of what God was doing. And so John right here is recording to us that when Jesus, he has his 12 people, he doesn't just focus upon the Jews. He's starting to do what the hope of the promises of God, of Abraham, and what the Messiah was supposed to do. He's doing those very things. Now, as Jesus has been guiding these 12 guys all over the place, teaching them what it means to be part of this new family of God, and he's presenting to them a code of ethic, a way of life of how do they be part of the community of Jesus that follows Jesus. And we see it in a lot of different ways. One of it is in John chapter 13, where he tells them in verse 34 that he's given them a new commandment, that they would love one another, just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. And by this, all people know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Right? And so this Jesus guy, he's going around, he's saying and doing all these amazing things, but how he teaches people how they should live as part of his community that he's launching out. Remember, that's one of the roles of the Messiah, is that he will launch God's people out to be a blessing upon the nations. He's identifying that this is going to happen as they learn to love as he has loved them, right? That he wants his people to be marked by this self-sacrifice, this selflessness, even when it costs them in humiliation and pain, right? And so there's this idea here that he's once again looking like a new and better Moses, giving commandments and statements about how they live as God's people in their hearts, and how do they show to the world the promises of Abraham, right? So this is Jesus not only fulfilling the promise of Abraham to create a family that would be a blessing upon the world, it's him launching this family to be that blessing. So he's not just only being the blessing, like we saw with the Samaritans, but he's teaching his people how they can go out to be a blessing. Once again, this is all a repeat of that big promise that was made to Abraham. It's really cool what Jesus is doing here, and it's really dramatic, and it's something we fully don't understand or grasp unless you recall that Abraham story. And that's, once again, that's in Genesis chapter 12, if you're not familiar with, but that's a huge deal to understanding what Jesus is doing. And this is a prime example where he is teaching, hey, I've been this blessing to all these other nations, like in the Samaritan story, and here's how you go out and do the same, by being people of love and self-sacrifice and selflessness, even if it was to cost you humiliation and pain. Okay, so we've seen Jesus kind of present himself as a new Moses. We've seen him announcing that the time had come for God to become king again, for the people to turn from their ways and to turn back to listening and loving God. We've seen him gather together all these disciples to kind of give this symbolic message everywhere he goes, that he's creating a new Israel and a new way of being in this relationship with this God, that the promises of God were finally happening. We've seen how he's even extending this invitation to people who aren't ethnically Jewish, and that sort of deal. So then this moment comes, and it's recorded to us in Matthew chapter 16, where he gathers together his disciples, and we're told in chapter 16, verse 13, that Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, Now, this area, there's a photo of it on the slide right here. It's actually a photo I took one time when I was in Israel, and that little hole or that big cave you see was a site of temple worship or of idol worship in the days of Jesus. There was a temple to Augustus Caesar over there, as well as there was a temple to this Greek god named Pan, who was this god of chaos and destruction. And so Jesus goes to a place that no Jew would ever go to. And he goes to this particular location, and there we're told that he asks his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? The phrase Son of Man was a title that Jesus kind of called himself. It comes out of Daniel chapter 7, and it was Daniel's way of describing the Messiah as this individual who's going to rule all the nations and set God's will upon the world. And so Jesus goes around, he's been calling himself that. And the report he gets from his disciples when he asks them, hey, who do people say that I am? They tell him, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. They're like, yeah, all these people think that you might be this prophet who's reincarnated, right? But Jesus asks them, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter replies, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now that's a rather important statement that he makes. The word Christ is the exact same word as the word Messiah. It's just a different language. So the word Messiah is in Hebrew. The word Christ is the word Messiah translated into Greek. So don't be confused by that. The word Christ is not Jesus' last name. It's a title of him as this Messiah. And then he says, the Son of the living God. Now that's also unique because he's making a statement of basically you are the true emperor of humanity. And I say that because in that day and age, Augustus Caesar, who was the emperor of Rome, was calling himself the Son of the living God. That's his title. He called himself Son of God. And so when the New Testament keeps calling Jesus Son of God, it's a very powerful statement. It's not just claiming that he's part of the Trinity and he's God incarnate. It's also claiming that he is the true ruler of all humanity. He's greater than the Roman emperor, which is what causes a lot of problems when we get to the book of Acts and in church history, why the church was so heavily persecuted by Rome, because they kept saying, hey, the homeless guy you killed, yeah, he's the true emperor of humanity. And so you can see why this would be a very controversial statement, where he's basically saying, Peter in this moment is saying, you're the Messiah and you're the emperor, the true emperor of all humanity. And Jesus doesn't turn him away. Instead, we're told in verse 17 that Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. And then when we look at verse 21, it says, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. So this is a very intimate moment where Jesus has been leading these guys, has been teaching them, and he asks them, he's like, hey, let's talk about who I really am. And he shares with them that he is this promised Messiah, that he believes himself to be God incarnate, acting as this promised Messiah, and then he does something rather strange. If you notice in verse 21, he tells them, he's like, we're about to go into Jerusalem. We're going to face a lot of opposition. The people who should be following me and should be believing me as a Messiah are going to be the ones who are going to turn against me. They're going to kill me. But don't worry, I'm going to rise again 3 days later. And that seems really crazy if you think about it. I mean, Jesus is predicting his own death and resurrection, but he's putting in the context of him as this Messiah, as this defeater of evil. So he's putting this together. He's like, I'm going to go and die as the means of evil being defeated. And when I rise again, it's going to be the means of God's new age breaking into the world. And so this is a rather dramatic statement. But if you think about it, he's going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 that we looked at already, of this promised wounded victor. And he's presenting himself as that narrative. He's like, I'm going to die, but by my destruction, evil's also going to have a death blow thrown against it. But God is going to raise me up and going to vindicate me, and I will be revealed to be God incarnate and revealed to be the true Messiah. And this is how God is going to win back humanity. It's rather dramatic, and it's understandable that the disciples don't actually believe him in this moment. I mean, would you? I mean, if someone came up to you and was like, "Hey, dude, I know how I'm going to die, and it's going to be by these steps, but don't worry, I'm going to come back to life." No one would believe you, right? Or believe whoever would say that. But that's what Jesus starts doing. Now, this has been a dramatic rise, a meteoric rise for Jesus in a lot of ways. But we're going to start turning the page. We're going to see this opposition that Jesus predicted that starts to come up, and it's ugly, it's brutal. But I just want to recap a little bit. Like, we've seen this Jesus, he's looking just like Moses. He's looking just like David. He's looking just like Solomon's promise. He's meeting all these standards of what the Messiah was supposed to be, and why this is significant, because the Messiah's role was to rescue humanity. And Jesus is putting himself in this narrative, believing himself to be that. But the way he goes about it is something that no one expected. And that's what we're going to start seeing as we start to turn the page on the story of Jesus too. It's a dark climax, but it's hopeful resolution. Now, if you recall, one of the roles or aspects of the promised Messiah was that he was going to defeat evil. Now, what was the source of evil in that day and age? It was the other nations. It was Rome in particular. And so the people had this idea that Jesus, not Jesus, but the Messiah, whoever that was going to be, was going to have to be someone who was going to face against the beasts, the enemy nations, these oppressive forces, and bring liberty to the people. And so when Jesus comes towards the end of his ministry, he comes into Jerusalem, and as he predicted, he starts to face oppositions. The way this narrative is described in all four Gospels is depicting Jesus doing this very thing. But what's unique about this is that the oppressive force isn't just seen in Rome, it's also seen in the heart of the people, particularly their religious system. And so when you look at the passion narratives, you need to see that this is Jesus fulfilling the role of the Messiah versus all that which would oppress the people. So there's a religious system that was all about keeping people away, about putting unrealistic expectations upon people, of crushing them under a weight of they must measure up to a certain standard. And here's Jesus, he's challenging that. He's showing himself to be very inclusive, while the religious leaders were against this. And Jesus starts to say some things that are constantly, as he gets to Jerusalem, constantly pointing out the corruption in the religious leaders, and they just can't take it. And so they orchestrate this interaction between Jesus and Rome to try to get Rome to kill Jesus, so that their hands are clean from all this. And so you get this narrative, especially in John chapter 18, where Jesus is he's been arrested, he's been brought in chains before the Roman governor, a man named Pontius Pilate. And it's this narrative of him arguing over the kingdom of heaven versus the kingdom of man, and who's really in charge, and who really has authority. And it's Jesus' battle against Rome. As Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, stands on the representative of Caesar, here's Jesus standing on representative of God and his kingdom. And it's this debate that they're having that's rather unique on who really has authority here, who's really in control. Now, what's unique about all the passion narratives of all four Gospels is that they're all depicted where Jesus is the one in control. No matter what situation he's in, he's the one who actually has the power, even if he remains silent. Even when other people are throwing accusations and he just sits there quietly, knowing that he could say something and end this, and he could say something and get himself out of this situation, he chooses to be silent. Or in John's narrative, he permits Pilate to announce the execution over him. This is a Jesus who seems to be accepting this fate. He wants Rome to kill him. He wants to take this punishment, and he's in control of this. He could stop this, but he's viewing this as, in his own way, this is him against the enemy, and he's letting the enemy kill him. So if you recall in our last lecture when we looked at the Old Testament, we saw God rescuing Israel from Egypt. And God kept trying to win over Pharaoh, and Pharaoh kept hardening their heart. So God intentionally, at that point, started to harden Pharaoh's heart. And it was all to kind of lead evil into its own destruction. That's kind of what Jesus is doing here. When he could open up, he could stop this. He's instead letting evil lead itself into its own destruction because he's declaring and he's been telling people that he's going to defeat evil by allowing evil to kill him. It's really strange, and it goes all the way back once again to Genesis chapter 3. But this is a Jesus who he wants to be in this situation. He wants to be ridiculed. He wants to be facing this pain and this punishment as he's going through these trials, as he's beaten, as he's whipped, as he's tortured, and then eventually he takes a cross, as we're going to look at in the next point. But even in this, you still see this Jesus who is still choosing to show mercy. So there's this moment where Pontius Pilate is trying to get Jesus freed, and he brings him out before the people, and then he brings out this other rebel named Barabbas, who's caused all sorts of trouble for the people. He's been a rebel and things like that, and he knows that the religious leaders are trying to get Jesus named as a rebel against Rome and killed, and so he brings out Barabbas, who actually is, and he offers a trade to the people, but the people want to release Barabbas and not Jesus. They want Jesus to suffer. And so even in this, you still see Jesus who could speak up, he can change this, but he chooses to trade places with a known rebel. That way he might die as this crime of being a rebel against Rome. It's this really powerful narrative in all four Gospels of Jesus in control, and this is how Jesus faces against the beast, the oppressive empire, all that is evil. This is how Jesus, in turn, subdues the nations by appearing to lay his life down and die. So despite all the trials that Jesus went through, and even the ways which Pontius Pilate tried to get Jesus off the charges because he knew Jesus was innocent, the death sentence is still pronounced over Jesus. And they're told that he must be crucified. And we're told about this, for instance, in Mark chapter 15, verse 22, where it says, "And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull." Golgotha was like this trash heap right outside the city. "And there they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it," which is like vinegar. And then verse 24 reads, "And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to divide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, 'The King of the Jews.'" So this is a really depressing moment where here's this guy who's trying to teach people to love, to even to the extent of self-sacrifice and a state of being selfless, to live this way. He's been healing people, and now he's being accused of being a rebel, and the charge that's put up against him is the King of the Jews. And it's made in mockery. It's put in 3 different languages so everyone would see, but it's unique because it's been put up there by the Romans. Where here's a foreign nation who's declaring in the eyes of everyone, hey, we are killing the King of the Jews. We're killing the one who claimed he was the Messiah, who claimed he was going to defeat us by claiming this title Messiah. And yet this is something that Jesus planned. It was something which, like we saw on a previous slide, he predicted his own death to the down to the details, saying, here's who's going to kill me, here's why, here's all the people who are going to betray me. And this is all seems to be part of Jesus' plan all along, that he's going to face this mode of death that was going to be humiliating, that was going to be excruciating. And he depicts it as by him doing this, he was going to have evil destroy itself. He was going to confront evil by having it kill him. And it's completely backwards. It's not what we would think. I mean, we live in an age where, you see those Hollywood movies where, oh man, there's this evil force. Well, we got to rise up. We got to get our army together. We got to get the weapons we need. And we got to fight against evil. And here's Jesus who goes at it alone. He's been abandoned. And he's intentionally walking into right in the path of the firing squad. And he's doing it because he says he loves the ones who are killing him. And he says that this is going to be how death will have its power stripped from it, and it will in itself kill itself by killing him. It's completely strange. And if this was the end of the story, it would look like this was a failure. We look at this and we're like, what did this accomplish? But it's the fact of what happens next that really puts the meaning behind what Jesus was trying to do. And it's what changes things from here on out. But I just want to go ahead and point out once again the unique aspect of this, where Jesus, he's been claiming to be the Messiah, and now the people are finally calling him the King of the Jews as they're crucifying him. And the statement is not coming from the lips of the Jews and the people of God in this story. It's coming from those who were thought to have been the evil oppressive empire, who are the ones who are declaring, this is the King of the Jews. And now look at him dead. It's a really depressing moment if the story was to end here. But the story's not over. When it comes to anyone else's story, typically their story ends when they die. They've got nothing left to contribute, nothing left to add into the world. The story is over. But what makes the story of Jesus so remarkable is that while his death was gruesome, it was violent, and yet he chose it willingly, and maybe even orchestrated it, we can argue. The story of Jesus does not end with his death. All four Gospels record something dramatic that happened in the life of Jesus. We look at it in Luke chapter 24, starting at verse 1. It says, "But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, 'Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of simple men and be crucified, and on the third day rise.'" See, this is what really was a big turning point in the Bible, and what we recognize in human history was the fact that this Jesus of Nazareth was crucified on a cross, and then he rose again 3 days later in accordance to what the Bible seems to be talking, what the witnesses and the disciples go out and spread, and how it causes this massive transformation of culture in the ancient Near East that continued to spread and shape culture for centuries, for the past 2,000 years, in fact. But let's look at what this actually represents. So this resurrection of Jesus is kind of God's vindication of Jesus and his ministry. It was kind of God's final approval and final showing that this was God in the flesh, his son, that all that Jesus had been saying about him being the king had actually happened. And it was pointing back to Isaiah chapter 53. Now you recall that you had to read chapters 52 and 53 of Isaiah. And in that, Isaiah talks about this Messiah who's going to be crucified, but was going to one day rise again. And Isaiah wrote that prophecy almost 500 years before Jesus ever walked the earth, and before there was even such a thing as crucifixion. Isaiah wrote down the details of it. And so this is God's vindication of Jesus as the Messiah, of Jesus, all that he's done. And there's several unique elements that are worth mentioning. For instance, all the gospel accounts of the resurrection of Jesus all point to the fact that it's a new week. And that's significant because if it goes all the way back to the creation narrative, you see that on Friday, God created humanity, and then on Saturday, God rested because he completed creation. And we see that play out in the Passion narrative where on Friday, Christ, Jesus, who represented the true Adam, the true Israel, the true humanity, he dies on the same day that represented the creation of man. And then he rested in his tomb on Saturday, just like God rested. And the fact that all the gospel writers talk about Jesus rising again on Sunday is not just so we can mark our calendar of the week or church attendance. The reason why all the gospel narratives mark down this narrative of Jesus rising again on Sunday, the start of the week, is to represent this message that they're trying to communicate, that this is the beginning of a new creation breaking in. where God has brought about a new way of life. This is with the Bible, the New Testament, writers like Paul and the apostles who write their letters are all kind of emphasizing that God has brought in his promises in the form of Jesus, the hopeful conclusion, the new heavens and new earth that they're waiting for, all of that's beginning to happen in that moment when Christ rose again and a new creation kind of invaded the old one, and now we live in this blended reality. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks of what this looks like in a topic called eschatology. But there's another important aspect that's being seen here. It's that Jesus defeated evil by allowing evil to kill him. He became the vessel of this evil. That's what he kept talking about over and over, that he was going to defeat evil by allowing it to kill him. It was going back to that promise centuries before Jesus, made in the book of Genesis, you recall, in Genesis chapter 3, of this wounded victor who's going to defeat evil by having it defeat him. But this is rather neat because this is how Jesus also claims that he has become king of the world, right? This is how the disciples proclaim that he's won a victory over all the nations. And that seems kind of confusing because you're thinking, well, wait, he hasn't kicked Caesar off his throne nor the religious leaders. He hasn't rallied an army together and stormed the gates of the enemy. So how exactly did he win a victory over the nations here when it looked like they beat him up and then they killed him? It's because if you think about it, where did Rome really get its power from? By the threat of death. By the force of crucifixion, Rome would show how strong it was and how it wielded death over its people. If you didn't get along with Rome, if you disobeyed them, if you turned against them, then they used that weapon of death upon you. You died. And here was Jesus, who death could not defeat him, and therefore he's robbed Rome of its true power. There's nothing that Rome or any other nation could do to now stop this Jesus. He's proven that he's unstoppable. Not even death can defeat him. And by that, this is why the church, they start proclaiming Jesus. He truly is the Messiah, the Christ. This is how they all rally behind this message that God has finally brought this Messiah. He's won a victory over all the nations. They must submit to him now because he's unbeatable. He's now the king over all the world. He's defeated evil, and he did it in a way not by wielding the biggest sword or weapon, but by allowing evil to throw the most it could throw at him, and he defeated it. He defeated evil by bringing it to its own death and conclusion, by allowing it to kill him. And that's what Luke and all the other gospel writers are kind of portraying in this resurrection account, that Christ is now risen, and that changes everything, right? That there's a new beginning that's breaking, and that God's promises that were talked about all throughout the Old Testament are coming to bear now, and it's on offer to humanity. This is what the Bible narrative seems to be telling us here. So with Jesus rising again and having defeated death, he has in turn defeated sin. And so now he's gathering together his disciples. They're all kind of shocked and stunned. They're like, hey, we just saw you get brutally executed. Now you're here standing in front of us. And he kind of informs them of a lot of things of like, hey, I'm going to launch you into this world, and I'm going to start something new and remarkable as you go out and share the message that sins can now be forgiven, that while sin once led to death, and it was, remember, the rebellion against God, God has dealt with that and now offered his hand in relationship and offered his hand in forgiveness and grace and mercy back to humanity. And so they're in charge, these disciples are in charge of heralding out that message. And we're going to look at that more in the next week's lecture, as we're going to look at the birth and the rise of this early church. But let's go and look at what is said in Matthew chapter 28 when Jesus gathers together his followers. It's in chapter 28, verse 16. It says, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. So this is, remember, another theme of the Gospels and responsibility of the Messiah is that this new family that he's created, he's now launching it out into the world to do his will. And this is him showing that he's able to command this because now he's got all authority. He's defeated the nations. This Jesus is now being proclaimed as the king of the universe. Remember, that was an important dynamic of what the Messiah was going to be. And so he's exercising that by sending out his people, his servants, those who choose to follow him, to represent his new humanity upon the world, to live according to the standard which he wants them to live, and for them to now listen and love God. Remember, that was a huge theme in the Old Testament. That was a huge failure on the people's part. But now Christ has done something dramatic, something new, and now he's sending out his people, just like, if you recall, how God sent humanity into the garden in the creation narrative and told them, hey, be fruitful and be a blessing upon the world. Here's Jesus doing the exact same thing. It's a remaking of the creation narrative of here's Christ. He is starting something new. He is sending out his new people who are choosing to follow him, who believe that he is this Messiah who has done this, and they go out and spread this message, and they go out to be the blessing as they were always promised to be, as they are always meant to be. All right, so as we start to draw this lecture to a close, let's take a moment and just recap everything that we kind of discussed in this lecture. Now, remember, we're looking through the Gospels. We're seeing how everything in the Old Testament was leading up to the Gospels, leading up to specifically Jesus, how this is a God who is on a mission to redeem humanity. This is the story that the Bible is telling us. And then we come to Jesus, and it sees or it shows us some very important things in the gospel accounts about this Jesus that we've learned and looked at so far. So we see that Jesus, as God in the flesh, he fulfills the promises of Genesis chapter 3 as one who will confront evil and defeat evil by mutual self-destruction. So remember, all the way back when humanity messed up in the garden, when Adam and Eve chose their own autonomy over listening and loving God, God responded by saying that he's going to deal with the problem of evil by sending a son born of the woman who is going to defeat evil but be killed by it in return. So here's Jesus acting in that regard, but we also see that this is God in the flesh taking on that role. We also see that Jesus is the true Israel that was promised to Abraham, that one day he was going to have a family who was going to be a blessing upon all the nations. And we see Jesus being what Israel was supposed to be. He is the true Israel, and he's gathering together a family, and he's acting as the blessing to all the nations, and then equipping and launching his followers to continue on what he started by continuing to be a blessing to all the nations, as they are now have the capability of listening and loving God because Jesus has dealt with their sin by dying on the cross. And then rising again. And then we also saw that Jesus, as the descendant of David, fulfills the promise of the Messiah that was made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And so this Messiah that we've been looking for, we find that Jesus meets all the qualifications, something that no one else has been able to do. And so he's the one who will subdue all the nations, who will bring the restoration of God and humanity back into the world. He's going to be used by God to set this world right. And so here's God who's taken on flesh to fulfill that requirement, to fulfill that role. And by his faithfulness, we see that Jesus in turn launches his upside down kingdom by dying for sin so that they can be forgiven. Remember, his ethic that he taught people was completely countercultural. In a world that was all about self-centeredness, here's Jesus. His message was always about, hey, loving others the way that Jesus has loved you. And he shows that by dying on a cross, saying that he's going to die on a cross for our sins out of love for us, and that this was going to be part of his plan on how to bring God and humanity back together, and that he knew that he was going to one day rise again, which is something remarkable. Whatever you think about Jesus, the fact that the dude predicted his own death and resurrection and then pulled it off is something dramatic that's not been heard and seen from. And for me, I'm like, yeah, that's a guy I want to listen to, right? Now, this Jesus also shows himself as the true human that invites others to join in with what he started. And that's what we kind of ended when we looked at the book of Matthew chapter 28. That's how the Gospels all kind of end, is that, hey, Jesus, he's been what humanity was supposed to be, and now he invites those who choose to follow him, who choose to believe in him, he invites them to continue onward what he started. And that's what we're going to look at next week's lecture of the start of the church, how God takes 12 little guys and then he grows into a movement of billions of people that's still taking place 2,000 years later. All right, before we end this lecture, let me go and remind you of the homework you have due for the next class. Remember, you have a paper that's due every class. This next one, you want to make sure on part 1 to look at Acts chapters 2, 4, and 9. And don't just regurgitate them to me. I want you to explain, in your opinion, how these chapters might influence a Christian worldview. If you need a reminder of that, you can go back to lecture number 1, look at the PowerPoint, and as we break down the elements of a worldview. And you can try to incorporate those of what you see and how you think these particular chapters shape how a Christian would view the world and how they would interact in the world. You also need to, in part 5, choose 5 new chapters from the Complete Bible and Answer book. By this point, you should be familiar on what's required of that. Remember, you need to discuss what the topic of the chapter was, whether or not you agree or disagree with it, and tell me why and how the argument was laid out by Hank and whether or not you think it was a good argument or not. Also, be reading Case for Christ. We're halfway through this class now, a little over halfway actually, and so you really need to be making sure that you're reading that book and probably go ahead and start working on that paper because it's a big one. Also, make sure that you do the discussion board. I know those don't count for many points, but they do add up, and I do really enjoy actually hearing your guys' thoughts and questions. Just remember, always be kind and courteous to one another as we're all learning in this course together. So until next time, have a good week.